My name is Sarah Mitchell, and when I think about that winter in Chicago, I can still feel the ice burning through my bones. I was only 28 years old, but I carried the weight of 100 winters on my shoulders. My 6-year-old son Tommy and I were living on the streets, huddled on a piece of cardboard that barely separated us from the frozen sidewalk. The wind cut through our threadbare clothes like razors, and hunger gnawed at our stomachs with relentless persistence. I had once dreamed of something different. A small apartment with warm walls, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, and Tommy's laughter echoing through clean hallways. But those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now. Someone who had never known the cruel indifference of concrete and steel. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. The streets of downtown Chicago showed no mercy that December. Steam rose from manholes like ghostly fingers reaching toward the gray sky, and the sound of traffic created a constant urban symphony that never let us truly rest. I remember the texture of that cardboard beneath us, rough and damp, slowly disintegrating under the weight of our bodies and the moisture from the sidewalk. Tommy would press himself against me, his small frame shivering despite the 2 thin jackets I had layered over his tiny shoulders. During the day, we moved through the city like shadows. I had learned which doorways offered the best shelter from the wind, which alleys provided momentary refuge, and which subway grates released enough warmth to thaw our frozen fingers for a few precious minutes. The smell of exhaust fumes mixed with the aroma of food from restaurants we could never enter, creating a sensory reminder of everything we had lost. People walked past us as if we were invisible. Their designer boots clicked against the pavement in rhythmic patterns, their conversations about holiday plans and dinner reservations floating above our heads like sounds from another world. I watched their faces. Some averted their eyes quickly. Others stared with a mixture of pity and disgust. And a few dropped coins into the cracked coffee cup I kept beside us with mechanical precision, never slowing their pace. The nights were the hardest. The temperature would plummet, and the city's harsh lights created an artificial dawn that never brought warmth. Tommy would curl up in my arms, his breathing shallow and rapid, and I would hold him tight while fear gnawed at my heart. I whispered stories to him in the darkness, tales of brave knights and magical kingdoms where little boys were always safe and warm. But even as the words left my lips, I wondered if I was lying to both of us. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of sirens, the rumble of late-night delivery trucks, and the constant vigilance required to keep us safe. I had learned to wake at the slightest change in our environment. Footsteps approaching too closely, voices raised in anger nearby, or the telltale signs that police officers were conducting their routine sweeps to move homeless people along. My body ached constantly. The cold had settled deep into my joints, making every movement painful. My hands were cracked and bleeding from exposure, and my lips were so chapped they split when I smiled at Tommy's attempts to cheer me up. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional weight I carried. The crushing guilt of having failed my son, the shame of our circumstances, and the growing fear that I was losing the battle to keep us both alive. Yet in those darkest moments, I still found myself looking up at the sliver of sky visible between the towering buildings. Sometimes, late at night, when the city finally quieted to a whisper, I would catch glimpses of stars fighting through the light pollution. Those distant points of light reminded me that there was something beyond the concrete jungle that had become our prison. Something vast and mysterious that might still hold hope for broken people like us. Tommy never complained. His resilience amazed me daily. He would find joy in the smallest things, a pigeon that wasn't afraid of us, the way snow looked when it caught the streetlights, or the rare occasions when someone would smile at him with genuine kindness. His innocence was both a blessing and a burden, because I knew that childhood was slipping away from him with each passing night on the streets. I had once been proud, perhaps too proud. I had refused help when it was offered, believing I could handle everything on my own. I had walked away from relationships and burned bridges, convinced that independence was strength. Now, Sitting on that cardboard with my son's small hand in mine, I understood that pride had been my enemy all along. It had isolated us, left us vulnerable, and brought us to this place where survival consumed every moment of every day. As December deepened and Christmas approached, the contrast between our reality and the joy surrounding us became almost unbearable. Store windows displayed scenes of domestic bliss, families gathered around dinner tables, children opening presents beneath decorated trees. The sounds of Christmas carols drifted from shops and restaurants, their messages of peace and goodwill seeming to mock our desperate situation. But it was during those longest, coldest nights that something began to stir within me. A whisper of possibility. A faint recognition that our story might not be over yet. I couldn't have known then that everything was about to change. That grace was preparing to meet us in our deepest darkness. All I knew was that despite everything, despite the pain and fear and crushing uncertainty, I still found myself hoping for something I couldn't name. Something that felt like it was just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It started 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning in September, when the eviction notice appeared on our apartment door like a death sentence. I still remember the official seal, the cold legal language that reduced our lives to past due amounts and court dates. Tommy was getting ready for school, his backpack slung over his shoulders, when I found the paper taped to our door. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and other people's cooking, familiar scents that I realized I was breathing in for perhaps the last time. "Mommy, what's that paper?" Tommy had asked, his 7-year-old curiosity cutting through my shock like a knife. I folded it quickly, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass against my face. "Just some mail, sweetheart. Go brush your teeth." But it wasn't just mail. It was the culmination of months of struggling to make ends meet, of choosing between rent and groceries, of watching the bills pile up while my part-time job at the diner barely covered our basic needs. The father of my child had disappeared when Tommy was 2, leaving behind only empty promises and a silence that echoed through our small apartment. I had been raising Tommy alone for 5 years, and until that moment, I had believed I was strong enough to handle anything. The diner where I worked sat on the corner of Michigan Avenue and 23rd Street, a greasy spoon that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and burgers that had seen better days. The owner, Frank Kowalski, was a heavy-set man with thick glasses and a perpetual scowl, who treated his employees like indentured servants. The air inside was always thick with the smell of frying onions and cigarette smoke that clung to everything despite the no-smoking signs. I had worked there for 3 years, arriving before dawn to prep vegetables and leaving late at night after cleaning the grill. My hands were permanently stained with grease, and my feet ached constantly from standing on the cracked linoleum floors. But it was honest work, and it had kept a roof over our heads, until the medical bills started arriving. Tommy had gotten sick in June, a respiratory infection that wouldn't clear up. Despite multiple doctor visits and prescriptions I could barely afford, the emergency room visits ate through what little savings I had managed to accumulate. And soon I was faced with impossible choices. I could pay rent or buy Tommy's medication, but not both. I chose his health, as any mother would. But the consequences were swift and merciless. "You're a good worker, Sarah," Frank had said when I explained my situation, his voice lacking any real sympathy. "But I can't give you more hours. Business is slow, and I got bills too." I had swallowed my pride and asked for an advance on my paycheck. But Frank's expression had told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. The restaurant industry was unforgiving, and employees were as replaceable as the paper napkins on the tables. The weeks that followed were a blur of desperate phone calls and humiliating conversations. I called my sister in Denver, whom I hadn't spoken to in 2 years after a bitter argument about Tommy's father. The conversation was brief and cold. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but we can't help right now. Jim lost his job last month, and we're barely keeping our heads above water ourselves." I tried social services, but the waiting lists were months long, and the bureaucracy moved with glacial slowness while our situation deteriorated daily. I applied for additional jobs, but most required experience I didn't have or shifts that would leave Tommy unsupervised. The few interviews I managed to secure ended with polite rejections and empty promises to keep your resume on file. The sound of Tommy's laughter became increasingly rare as our situation worsened. He began having nightmares about monsters that came in the night to take our home away, and I would hold him in the darkness, whispering reassurances I no longer believed myself. The apartment that had once felt like our sanctuary became a source of anxiety, each creak of the floorboards reminding us that we were living on borrowed time. The final blow came on a Thursday morning in October. I arrived at the diner to find a new girl behind the counter, her name tag reading Jennifer in cheerful red letters. Frank avoided my eyes as he handed me my final paycheck, the amount smaller than usual due to what he called scheduling adjustments. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, his thick Chicago accent making the words sound even more insincere. "Had to cut back. You understand." I understood perfectly. I was being replaced by someone younger, someone without complications or desperate financial needs that might affect their work performance. I walked out into the autumn air, feeling like I had been punched in the stomach, the check in my pocket representing our last connection to stability. That night, I sat at our small kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, running numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times I tried. The eviction notice gave us 30 days, but our resources wouldn't last half that long. I looked around the apartment, at Tommy's drawings taped to the refrigerator, at the small Christmas tree we had bought at a discount lot the previous year and never thrown away, at all the humble possessions that represented our attempt at building a life together. The decision to leave came not as a conscious choice, but as an inevitable conclusion to a mathematical equation that had no solution. We couldn't afford to stay, but we had nowhere else to go. The shelters were full, my credit was destroyed, and my family had made their position clear. We were on our own, and winter was coming. I remember the morning we packed our belongings into 2 garbage bags and a worn duffel bag that had belonged to Tommy's father. Tommy asked questions I couldn't answer. "Where are we going, Mommy? Will I still go to school? Can we take Mr. Bear?" The stuffed animal he referred to was a threadbare teddy bear that had been his comfort since infancy, and I assured him that Mr. Bear would come with us, even though I wasn't sure where us was going to be. We walked out of that apartment carrying everything we owned, leaving behind the security deposit we would never see again, and stepping into an uncertainty that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The hallway that had once felt like home now seemed like the corridor of a prison we were finally escaping. Except there was nowhere to escape to. The first night on the streets was the hardest. We huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore, the smell of old paper and leather bindings seeping through the cracks around the door. Tommy cried softly, not understanding why we couldn't go home, and I held him close while my own tears fell silently into his hair. The pride that had once defined me crumbled that night, replaced by a raw vulnerability that left me feeling exposed to every wind that blew through the urban canyon of downtown Chicago. The city revealed its hidden cruelties slowly, like peeling back layers of skin to expose raw nerves beneath. Our first week on the streets taught us lessons no parent should ever have to teach their child. Lessons about survival that had nothing to do with the bedtime stories I used to read to Tommy in our warm apartment. We learned that timing was everything. The library opened at 9 in the morning, providing blessed hours of warmth and shelter where Tommy could use the bathroom, and I could pretend to read while actually sleeping upright in one of the worn armchairs. The children's section became our temporary sanctuary, surrounded by picture books that reminded us of better times. But at 5 o'clock, the security guard would make his rounds, and we would have to venture back into the unforgiving streets. The McDonald's on State Street became our evening refuge. For the price of a small coffee that I nursed for hours, we could sit in a booth with fluorescent lighting and the constant hum of the ice cream machine. Tommy would color on napkins with a broken crayon I had found, creating masterpieces on paper that would dissolve if it got wet. The teenage employees, mostly kids not much older than Tommy, would look at us with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, but they never asked us to leave as long as I kept buying something every few hours. The smells of the street became our new normal, exhaust fumes mixed with the aroma of food we couldn't afford, creating a sensory landscape that was both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. Steam from manholes carried the mysterious sense of the city's underground systems, sometimes warm and sometimes acrid, always reminding us that there was a whole world beneath our feet that we would never see. I learned to recognize the different types of people who walked past us. There were the commuters, always checking their phones, always in a hurry, who would drop spare change without breaking stride. There were the tourists, cameras around their necks, who would sometimes stop to take pictures of the city's authentic street life while avoiding eye contact with the actual people living it. And then there were the other homeless people, who would nod in recognition or share information about where to find food or which areas to avoid after dark. An older man named Robert became our informal guide to street survival. He had been homeless for 3 years after losing his job and his wife in the same devastating month, and he knew every shelter, every soup kitchen, and every safe place to sleep within a 10-block radius. His beard was gray and unkempt, his clothes held together with safety pins and determination. But his eyes still held a kindness that hadn't been extinguished by his circumstances. Rule number 1, he told me during our second week, as we sat sharing a sandwich from a church group that distributed food near Grant Park. Never let them see you're afraid. Fear marks you as prey, and there's plenty of predators out here who'll take advantage. He taught us about the unspoken hierarchy of the streets, about which corners belonged to which people and how to navigate the complex social structure of the homeless community. Some people had been living rough for decades, their minds fractured by years of trauma and substance abuse. Others, like us, were new to the streets, still fighting to maintain some semblance of dignity and hope. Tommy adapted with the resilience that only children possess, but I could see the changes in him. He became quieter, more watchful, his childhood innocence replaced by a premature awareness of danger. He learned to sleep sitting up, to eat quickly before anyone could take his food away, and to never wander more than arm's length from me. The spontaneous joy that had once defined his personality retreated behind walls of caution and survival instinct. The physical toll was relentless. My body, already weakened by months of poor nutrition, began to break down under the constant stress of exposure and sleep deprivation. My hands developed painful cracks that wouldn't heal, and a persistent cough settled into my chest like an unwelcome tenant. But it was the emotional exhaustion that nearly destroyed me. The constant vigilance required to keep us safe, the daily humiliation of begging for basic necessities, and the crushing weight of knowing that I had failed to protect my son from this nightmare. The nights were when the city showed its true face. After dark, Chicago transformed into something predatory and dangerous. The police would sweep through downtown, moving homeless people along with flashlights and commands that brooked no argument. We learned to recognize the sound of their boots on the pavement, the crackle of their radios, and the tone of voice that meant we needed to gather our belongings and find somewhere else to exist. One night in early November, we were forced to move 4 times before finally settling in an alley behind a Chinese restaurant. The smell of grease from their dumpster mixed with the more unpleasant odors of urban decay, creating an atmosphere that seemed to coat our skin and clothes with a film of despair. Tommy whimpered in his sleep, and I held him closer, feeling his small body tremble with cold, despite the layers of clothing I had wrapped around him. It was that night that I first began to pray seriously. Not the casual prayers I had offered in church as a child, but desperate pleas torn from the depths of my soul. I looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings and begged whatever divine presence might be listening to help us survive another night, to keep Tommy safe, to show us a way out of the darkness that seemed to be swallowing us whole. The response was silence, not the peaceful silence of contemplation, but the empty silence of a universe that seemed indifferent to our suffering. The stars, barely visible through the city's light pollution, offered no comfort, and the sounds of the city continued their relentless symphony without pause for our pain. But something had changed in that moment of raw honesty with the divine. I had acknowledged my complete helplessness, admitted that my pride and self-reliance had been illusions all along. In stripping away every pretense and facade, I had reached a place of authentic vulnerability that I had never experienced before. I didn't know it then, but that moment of surrender was the first crack in the wall that separated us from grace. Tommy stirred in my arms, and I adjusted the thin blanket around his shoulders. feeling the sharp edges of his ribs through his clothes. His breathing was steady but shallow, and I pressed my hand against his chest to reassure myself that he was still with me, still fighting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new humiliations, and new tests of our ability to survive. But tonight, we were together. And for the moment, that would have to be enough. The sound of a distant church bell tolled midnight, marking another day survived and another day begun. I closed my eyes and tried to find sleep, knowing that rest would come in fragments interrupted by the need for vigilance. But somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, I felt a presence watching over us, something that felt like protection in a world that had shown us only cruelty. December arrived like a predator stalking its prey, bringing with it temperatures that turned the city into an Arctic wasteland. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through downtown Chicago with surgical precision, finding every gap in our inadequate clothing and every exposed inch of skin. The weather forecast on the electronics store window display predicted the coldest night of the winter so far, temperatures dropping to 15 below zero with wind chills that could kill. By this time, Tommy and I had been on the streets for 2 months. My son's face had grown gaunt, his cheeks hollow with malnutrition, and his eyes held a weariness that no 7-year-old should ever carry. I had managed to find him a heavy winter coat at a thrift store, using the last of the money I had earned from collecting aluminum cans. But it was too big for his shrinking frame and hung on him like armor on a scarecrow. The shelters were full, as they always were when the weather turned deadly. We had been turned away from 3 different facilities that day, each time hearing the same apologetic explanation about capacity and waiting lists. The Salvation Army shelter had a line that wrapped around the block, filled with people who looked as desperate as we felt. An argument broke out near the front of the line, voices raised in anger and frustration, and I pulled Tommy away before the situation could escalate further. "Are we going to freeze tonight, Mommy?" he asked, as we walked away from our last hope of indoor shelter. His voice was matter-of-fact, without the fear that such a question should have carried. He had learned to accept the possibility of death with the same resignation that other children accepted bedtimes. "No, baby," I lied, my breath creating clouds in the frigid air. "We're going to find somewhere warm." But warm was a relative concept on the streets of Chicago in December. We had claimed a spot in the recessed doorway of an abandoned office building, where a small overhang provided minimal protection from the snow that had begun to fall in thick, heavy flakes. I had layered every piece of clothing we owned over Tommy's small frame, and still he shivered uncontrollably against me. The cardboard beneath us was frozen solid, offering no insulation from the concrete sidewalk that seemed to radiate cold up through our bodies. I wrapped my arms around Tommy, trying to share what little body heat I had left, but I could feel my own core temperature dropping. My fingers were numb despite the torn gloves I wore, and my feet had lost all sensation hours ago. As darkness fell, the city transformed into something alien and hostile. The usual sounds of traffic diminished as people stayed indoors, leaving us alone with the howling wind and the steady whisper of falling snow. Street lamps created yellow pools of light that only emphasized how dark and empty the world had become. The few people who passed by moved quickly, bundled in expensive coats, and hurrying toward warm destinations we could only imagine. I told Tommy stories to keep both of us awake, because I knew that falling asleep in these conditions could mean not waking up. I recounted fairy tales from my own childhood, changing the endings to make them more hopeful, more magical. But my voice grew weaker as the night progressed, and I found it increasingly difficult to form words through chattering teeth and cracked lips. "Tell me about the house again, Mommy," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. He was asking about the apartment we had lost. But in our private mythology, it had become something grander. A house with a fireplace and warm beds and a kitchen that always smelled like cookies. "It has big windows," I began, the familiar words coming automatically despite my exhaustion. "And when the sun shines through them in the morning, it makes patterns on the floor like golden puzzle pieces. And there's a reading corner with soft cushions where you can sit with your books and Mr. Bear." He pressed closer to me, and I could feel his small body relaxing slightly as the story transported him away from our frozen reality. But I could also feel how frighteningly cold he had become, how his shivering had evolved into something more sporadic and dangerous. Hypothermia was setting in for both of us, and I knew we were running out of time. Around midnight, when the temperature had dropped to its most brutal point, I found myself facing the possibility that we might not survive the night. The realization came not as panic, but as a strange kind of peace, a release from the constant struggle that our lives had become. If we were going to die, at least we would die together. And Tommy would never have to experience another day of hunger or cold or fear. It was then that I began to pray with an intensity I had never experienced before, not the desperate bargaining I had attempted in previous weeks, but something deeper and more honest. A conversation with whatever force governed the universe, acknowledging that I had reached the absolute limit of my human strength and needed intervention that could only come from beyond myself. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered into the night, my words disappearing into the wind as soon as they left my lips. "If you're there, if you're real, please help us. Please don't let Tommy die because of my failures. He's innocent. He deserves better than this." The prayer felt different from any religious experience I had ever had. It wasn't a formal petition recited from memory, but a raw offering of my complete helplessness. I acknowledged that I had tried to control everything, that my pride had isolated us from help, and that I was finally ready to surrender the illusion that I could save us through my own efforts alone. Tommy had grown very still in my arms, his breathing shallow and irregular. When I touched his cheek, his skin felt like ice, and a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced crashed through me. I shook him gently, and his eyes fluttered open, but they seemed to focus on something I couldn't see. "It's so warm now, Mommy," he murmured, his voice dreamy and distant. "Do you see the light?" I looked around frantically, seeing nothing but darkness and snow. But Tommy was staring at something beyond my perception with wonder in his eyes. His shivering had stopped completely, a sign I knew was dangerous rather than comforting. We were losing the battle against the cold, and I had no weapons left to fight with except the fierce love of a mother for her child. "Stay with me, Tommy," I pleaded, holding him tighter. "Stay awake. Talk to Mommy." But even as I spoke the words, I felt my own consciousness beginning to fade. The cold had moved past pain into a strange numbness that seemed to be pulling me towards sleep. The boundary between life and death became thin in that frozen doorway, and I understood that we were standing at a threshold that countless people before us had crossed alone and forgotten. In that moment of ultimate despair, when all hope had been exhausted and all strength depleted, something extraordinary began to happen. The darkness around us seemed to shift, as if the very air was preparing for the arrival of something that existed beyond the natural world. And though I couldn't have known it then, we were about to encounter grace in its most pure and transformative form. The change came so gradually that I almost missed it. At first, I thought it was hypothermia playing tricks with my perception, the way extreme cold can create hallucinations and false sensations of warmth. But the shift in the atmosphere was too subtle, too gentle to be a product of my dying brain. It began with the wind. The howling gusts that had been tearing through the downtown corridor suddenly died to a whisper, as if someone had placed an invisible barrier around our small corner of the world. The snow continued to fall, but it no longer stung our faces or found its way into every fold of our clothing. The silence that followed was profound, not the empty silence of abandonment I had become accustomed to, but a peaceful quiet that seemed to wrap around us like a blanket. Tommy stirred in my arms, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were clearer than they had been in hours. The dangerous drowsiness that had been pulling him toward unconsciousness had lifted, replaced by an alertness that should have been impossible given our condition. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice stronger now. "Someone's coming." I looked into the swirling snow, expecting to see nothing more than the empty street and the distant glow of traffic lights. But there, moving through the white darkness with steps that seemed to make no sound on the frozen pavement, was a figure approaching us with deliberate purpose. At first, I thought it might be a police officer making rounds, or perhaps a social worker from one of the outreach programs that occasionally ventured out on the coldest nights. But as the figure drew closer, I realized this was something entirely different, the person, and somehow I knew without question that it was a person, despite the otherworldly quality of their approach, moved with a grace that seemed unaffected by the weather conditions that had brought us to the brink of death. The light came next. Not a harsh beam from a flashlight or the yellow glow of a street lamp, but a soft radiance that seemed to emanate from the figure itself. It wasn't bright enough to be seen from a distance, but it illuminated the space around us with a warmth that went beyond the physical. I blinked hard, certain that exhaustion and cold were creating this vision, but when I opened my eyes, the gentle light remained. Tommy sat up straighter in my arms. His small face turned toward the approaching figure with an expression of wonder rather than fear. His intuitive trust surprised me, because he had learned to be wary of strangers during our weeks on the street. But something about this presence felt different, safe in a way that transcended rational explanation. "Don't be afraid," the figure said, and the voice carried clearly despite the muffled acoustics of the falling snow. It was a man's voice, warm and resonant, speaking English with an accent I couldn't quite place, but that sounded ancient and familiar at the same time. As he came closer, I could see his face in the soft light that surrounded him. He appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair and eyes that held depths I had never seen in another human being. His clothing was simple, a wool coat that looked handmade, sturdy boots that showed signs of long travel, and a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck. But there was something about his presence that commanded attention without demanding it, something that spoke of authority, tempered by infinite compassion. He knelt down in front of us, seemingly unconcerned with the snow that immediately began to gather on his shoulders. When he looked at Tommy, his expression held such tenderness that I felt tears freezing on my cheeks before I realized I was crying. "Hello, little one," he said to my son, extending his hand palm up in a gesture of greeting rather than expectation. "You've been very brave." Tommy, who had barely spoken above a whisper for days, found his voice. "Are you here to help us?" "I am," the man replied, and in those two words, I heard a promise that felt more solid than any contract or guarantee I had ever encountered. "May I?" he asked, reaching toward Tommy with hands that seemed to radiate the same gentle warmth as his presence. I nodded, though I'm not sure why. Every instinct developed through months of street survival should have made me protective of physical contact with strangers. But this felt different. This felt like the answer to prayers I had screamed into the void during our darkest moments. When his hands touched Tommy's face, my son's shivering stopped immediately. Color returned to his cheeks, and his breathing deepened into the natural rhythm of a healthy child. It was impossible, medically and logically impossible, but I watched it happen with my own eyes. Then he turned to me, and when our eyes met, I felt something break open inside my chest. It was as if he could see every mistake I had ever made, every moment of pride and stubbornness that had led us to this frozen doorway. But instead of judgment, his expression held only love. Not pity, not condescension, but a love so pure and unconditional that it felt like being seen truly for the first time in my life. "Sarah," he said, and hearing my name spoken with such gentleness was almost more than I could bear. "You are not alone. You have never been alone." He reached out and placed his hands on my shoulders, and the cold that had been killing us slowly for hours disappeared instantly. Warmth flooded through my body, but it was more than physical heat. It was the warmth of being welcomed home after a lifetime of wandering, of being forgiven for failures I had never been able to forgive myself. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew the answer in a place deeper than knowledge. He smiled, and in that smile I saw infinite patience, infinite kindness, and a joy that seemed to encompass every good thing that had ever existed. "I think you know," he said simply. And I did know, with a certainty that bypassed every rational thought and skeptical argument I had ever entertained. This was Jesus. The same Jesus I had learned about in Sunday school as a child. The same Jesus I had dismissed as mythology when I grew older and more sophisticated. He was here, in a frozen doorway in downtown Chicago, holding my dying son and offering us life. But why? I whispered. Why us? Why now? Because you called my name, he said, and I remembered the desperate prayers I had offered into the night, the pleas for help that I had been certain were falling on deaf ears. Because love doesn't abandon its children, even when they believe they have been forgotten. The snow had stopped falling around us, though I could see it continuing to accumulate in the street beyond our small circle of warmth and light. Time seemed suspended, as if the entire universe had paused to witness this moment of divine intersection with human need. Tommy had fallen into a peaceful sleep in Jesus' arms, the kind of deep, restorative sleep that had been impossible during our weeks of survival. His face was relaxed and content, free from the tension and worry that had aged him beyond his years. Watching him rest so peacefully, I felt a hope beginning to grow that I had thought was dead forever. "What happens now?" I asked, because even in the presence of the miraculous, the practical concerns of a mother couldn't be completely silenced. "Now you rest," Jesus said, and as he spoke, I felt an exhaustion deeper than any I had ever experienced settling over me. "And when you wake, you will remember that you are beloved, that you are seen, and that your story is far from over." As consciousness began to fade, I felt his hand on my forehead, and the last thing I remembered was the sound of his voice, speaking words of blessing and promise that seemed to echo in my bones long after I could no longer hear them. I woke to the sound of voices and the scent of fresh coffee, sensations so foreign to my recent experience that I thought I must still be dreaming. The warmth surrounding me was real and substantial, not the false heat of hypothermia, but genuine comfort that seemed to flow from an external source. My eyes opened slowly, adjusting to light that was softer and kinder than the harsh fluorescence I had grown accustomed to in public spaces. Tommy was sleeping beside me, his small body finally relaxed and still. His breathing was deep and regular, and when I touched his forehead, his skin felt warm and healthy. The grayish pallor that had worried me for weeks had been replaced by the natural color of childhood. It was as if the night that should have killed us had instead restored us to life. We were lying on sleeping bags inside what appeared to be a church basement, surrounded by the quiet bustle of people preparing breakfast. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and children's artwork decorated every available surface. A banner reading, "All are welcome here," hung above a makeshift kitchen where volunteers in aprons moved with practiced efficiency. A woman with silver hair and gentle eyes approached us carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She was probably in her 60s, wearing a cardigan that looked like it had been knitted by loving hands, and a name tag that read, "Helen, volunteer." "Good morning, dear," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had spent years caring for others. "How are you feeling?" I struggled to sit up, my body stiff from lying on the floor, but free from the bone-deep cold that had been my constant companion. I began, trying to piece together the fragments of memory from the night before. "There was a man. He helped us." Helen smiled knowingly as she handed me one of the mugs. "Father Martinez found you both around 3 this morning, nearly frozen in that doorway on State Street. He said it was like you were protected by some kind of bubble. The snow had piled up everywhere except right where you were lying." Father Martinez. I looked around the basement, searching for a face that might match my memory of the man who had saved us. But the volunteers I could see were all people from the neighborhood, their faces kind but unfamiliar. "Father Martinez isn't here right now," Helen continued, seeming to read my thoughts. He had to leave early for another call, but he left specific instructions about your care. He said to tell you that you're welcome to stay as long as you need, and that there are resources available to help you get back on your feet. Tommy stirred beside me, his eyes opening with the slow awareness of genuine rest rather than the hypervigilant alertness that had become his normal way of waking. When he saw me watching him, he smiled, the first completely unguarded smile I had seen from him in months. "Mommy, I had the most beautiful dream," he said, stretching his small arms above his head. "There was a man with the kindest eyes, and he told me that we were going to be okay. He said that God never stops looking for his lost children." Helen's expression softened as she listened to Tommy's words. "Children often remember things differently than adults do," she said quietly. "Sometimes they see with clearer eyes." She knelt down to Tommy's level and offered him a smaller mug filled with hot chocolate. "My name is Helen. Would you like some breakfast? We have pancakes this morning, and I think there might be some syrup with your name on it." As Tommy nodded enthusiastically, I felt a shift in the atmosphere of our lives that went deeper than physical comfort or immediate safety. For months, we had been defined by our needs, our hunger, our cold, our fear. Now, for the first time since losing our apartment, someone was offering us something without expecting anything in return, treating us as guests rather than problems to be solved. Over breakfast, Helen shared the story of St. Andrew's Community Center, the church-affiliated outreach program that had found us. It had been serving Chicago's homeless population for 15 years, offering not just emergency shelter, but comprehensive services designed to help people rebuild their lives. "We don't just put Band-Aids on problems," she explained, as Tommy worked his way through a stack of pancakes that seemed to disappear as quickly as she could cut them. "We believe in addressing root causes, finding people jobs, helping them secure housing, connecting them with healthcare, providing childcare support." She pulled out a folder filled with forms and information sheets. "There's a transitional housing program that has an opening. A small apartment where you and Tommy could stay for up to 18 months while you get back on your feet. There's also a childcare center associated with the program, so Tommy could have supervised care while you look for work." The offer felt too good to be true, too perfectly tailored to our specific needs to be coincidental. I had learned to be suspicious of unexpected kindness, to look for hidden costs or conditions that would inevitably emerge. But as I studied Helen's face, I saw only genuine care and the kind of hope that comes from having witnessed many successful transitions from despair to stability. "What's the catch?" I asked, hating the cynicism in my voice but unable to suppress it entirely. Helen's smile was patient and understanding. "The catch is that you have to be willing to accept help," she said. "The catch is that you have to believe that you deserve better than what you've been given. For a lot of people, that's the hardest part." She was right. During our weeks on the street, I had begun to internalize the message that society seemed to be sending, that we were disposable, that our suffering was somehow our fault, that we deserved whatever circumstances we found ourselves in. The idea that we might be worthy of genuine assistance, that our lives had value worth investing in, felt foreign and almost frightening. Tommy, meanwhile, had discovered a box of toys in the corner of the room and was playing with a set of blocks, building elaborate structures and narrating their construction with the kind of imaginative play that had been absent during our survival-focused existence on the streets. Watching him play, I realized how much of his childhood had been stolen by our circumstances, and how much I wanted to give that back to him. "Father Martinez left something for you," Helen said, reaching into her sweater pocket. She pulled out a small wooden cross, simple and smooth, obviously carved by hand. "He said to tell you that this is a reminder that you are never walking alone, even when you can't see the path ahead." As I took the cross, it felt warm in my palm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight rather than in Helen's pocket. The wood was a rich brown color, and the craftsmanship spoke of hours of patient work by someone who understood that small gestures could carry enormous meaning. "When can we meet Father Martinez?" I asked, eager to thank the man who had saved our lives and express my gratitude properly. Helen's expression became thoughtful, almost puzzled. "That's the interesting thing, dear. I've been volunteering here for 8 years, and I've never heard of any Father Martinez associated with our program. Our parish priest is Father O'Brien, and he's been here for over a decade. When I asked this morning about who had brought you in, everyone assumed it was one of our regular outreach volunteers, but none of them remember making the call." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with temperature. But someone brought us here. Someone found us. Oh, absolutely, Helen said quickly. There's no question about that. You were both here when I arrived this morning, sleeping peacefully in those exact sleeping bags. It's just that no one seems to remember exactly how you got here or who made the arrangements. I looked down at the wooden cross in my hand, and Tommy's words from the night before echoed in my memory. There was a man with the kindest eyes. The rational part of my mind wanted to find a logical explanation, but the deeper truth that lived in my heart already understood what had happened. We had been found by love itself, rescued by grace in a form that transcended ordinary human understanding. The details of how and when seemed less important than the fundamental truth that we had not been abandoned, that our prayers had been heard, and that our story was far from over. As I sat in that warm basement, holding the wooden cross and watching my son play with joy for the first time in months, I felt something shift permanently inside me. The pride that had kept me isolated, the shame that had made me believe I deserved suffering, the despair that had convinced me we were forgotten. All of it began to dissolve like snow in sunlight. We had been given not just a second chance, but a clear demonstration that we were valued, that our lives mattered, and that help often comes in forms we never expect. The journey ahead would still require courage and hard work. But now I knew we wouldn't be walking it alone. The transitional apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in Lincoln Park, with windows that faced east toward Lake Michigan. The morning sun would stream through the glass, creating geometric patterns on the hardwood floors that reminded me of the house I used to describe to Tommy during our coldest nights. It wasn't large, just 1 bedroom, a small living area, and a kitchen with appliances that actually worked. But after months of sleeping on cardboard, it felt like a palace. Tommy discovered the bathtub on our first day, spending nearly an hour in hot water that never ran cold, playing with a rubber duck that Helen had thoughtfully included in the care package waiting for us. I sat on the bathroom floor listening to him splash and giggle, sounds I had almost forgotten he was capable of making, and felt tears of gratitude running down my cheeks. The child care center occupied the ground floor of a community center 6 blocks away, staffed by certified teachers who treated the children of transitional families with the same care and attention they would give to any student. Tommy's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was a young woman with infinite patience and an instinctive understanding of children who had experienced trauma. He's a bright boy, she told me after Tommy's first week, but he startles easily at loud noises, and he hoards snacks in his cubby. These are normal responses to insecurity about resources. We'll work on it gently. The way she spoke about Tommy's behaviors as adaptive rather than problematic, as reasonable responses to unreasonable circumstances rather than character flaws, helped me begin to reframe my own self-perception. Maybe I wasn't a failure as a mother. Maybe I had simply been navigating impossible circumstances with insufficient resources. Finding work proved easier than I had expected. The community center's job placement program connected me with a position at a nonprofit that provided emergency assistance to families in crisis. Families like Tommy and I had been just weeks before. The irony wasn't lost on me that I would be helping others navigate the same systems that had recently helped us. But there was something profoundly healing about turning our experience into service. My supervisor, David Chen, was a former social worker who had transitioned into program management after 20 years of direct service. During my interview, he asked about my background with unusual directness. I see from your application that you have recent personal experience with homelessness, he said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. How do you think that experience would inform your work here? I had prepared for this question, rehearsing answers that would emphasize resilience and understanding while minimizing the rawness of what we had endured. But sitting in his office, surrounded by certificates and photos of families who had been helped by the program, I found myself speaking with unexpected honesty. I understand what it feels like to sit in a waiting room full of people who need help, knowing that there aren't enough resources for everyone, I said. I know what it's like to fill out forms when you're so tired and scared that you can barely think straight. And I know how much it means when someone treats you like a human being instead of a problem to be processed. David nodded thoughtfully. That kind of empathy can be a tremendous asset. but it can also be overwhelming if you don't maintain proper boundaries. The families you'll be working with will be in crisis situations similar to what you experienced. How will you take care of yourself while helping them? It was a fair question, and one I had been wrestling with since accepting the position. The wooden cross from Father Martinez had become a daily reminder that I wasn't carrying this responsibility alone, but I was still learning how to balance service with self-care. The evening routine Tommy and I developed became a source of stability for both of us. After dinner, we would sit together on the small couch in our living room, and I would read to him from books we borrowed from the public library. His favorites were stories about children who overcame challenges through courage and kindness, tales that seemed to help him process his own experiences in a safe, metaphorical framework. "Mommy," he said one evening as I was reading about a young boy who befriended a dragon, "do you think the man who helped us was really Jesus?" The question caught me off guard, partly because I had been wondering the same thing but hadn't found the courage to voice it. In the weeks since our rescue, I had tried to construct rational explanations for what we had experienced. Hypothermia-induced hallucinations, a confused memory of an actual rescue worker, the kind of myth-making that trauma sometimes produces. But the wooden cross on my nightstand, the perfect timing of our rescue, and the profound change in both our circumstances and our spirits suggested something beyond coincidental intervention. "I think," I said carefully, "that help sometimes comes in ways we don't expect, from sources we don't understand. Whether the man who helped us was Jesus, or an angel, or just someone sent by Jesus to find us, doesn't change the fact that we were saved when we needed saving most." Tommy considered this with the seriousness that children bring to theological questions. "I'm glad he found us," he said finally. I was getting really scared. The admission broke my heart, because Tommy had been so brave throughout our ordeal, so protective of my feelings even while dealing with his own fear. I pulled him closer and kissed the top of his head, breathing in the clean scent of the strawberry shampoo he had chosen at the grocery store the week before. "Me too, baby," I said. "Me too." Our first Christmas in the apartment was simple but profound. We couldn't afford many presents, but we had each other. We had warmth, and we had hope for the future. I found an artificial tree at a thrift store, already decorated with lights that mostly worked, and Tommy made ornaments from construction paper and glitter provided by his childcare center. On Christmas Eve, we attended services at St. Andrew's, the church associated with the community center where we had first found refuge. The sanctuary was decorated with poinsettias and evergreen boughs, and the congregation sang carols with voices that filled the vaulted ceiling with joy. During the service, I found myself scanning the faces of the clergy and volunteers, looking for someone who might be Father Martinez. But Helen had been right. There was no priest by that name associated with the church, and when I asked Father O'Brien about him after the service, he looked genuinely puzzled. "I'm not familiar with anyone by that name in our archdiocese," he said kindly. "But I'm grateful to whoever helped you find your way to us. Sometimes God's messengers aren't who we expect them to be." Walking home from church that night, Tommy's hand warm in mine, and the lights of the city twinkling like earthbound stars around us, I felt a peace that seemed to emanate from the very core of my being. We had traveled from the edge of death to the beginning of new life, and while the journey hadn't been easy, it had led us to a place of genuine hope. The wooden cross sat on my nightstand, a tangible reminder that we were not alone in the world, that love was real and active, and always seeking opportunities to manifest itself in broken places. Our story was far from over, but I knew now that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them with the knowledge that grace was real, that miracles still happened, and that even in the darkest night, light was always on its way. As I tucked Tommy into his own bed in his own room, listening to him say prayers that now included thanks for warmth and food and safety, I understood that our rescue had been about more than physical survival. We had been saved from despair, restored to hope, and reminded that every human life has infinite worth in the eyes of the divine. 2 years later, I stood in the same doorway where Tommy and I had nearly died, but But this time I wasn't alone in my vulnerability. I was there as part of the outreach team from the community center, carrying sleeping bags and thermoses of hot soup to people who were exactly where we had been. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the one extending help to those who had nowhere else to turn. The man huddled in the corner looked to be about 50, his beard gray and unkempt, his eyes holding the hollow desperation I remembered so well. His name was Marcus, and he had been on the streets for 6 months after losing his construction job and then his apartment. When he saw me approaching, his body tensed with the defensive posture of someone who had been disappointed by false promises too many times. "It's cold out here," I said, settling down beside him without waiting for permission. "Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" He nodded warily, and I handed him a thermos of soup. "My name's Sarah. I work with St. Andrew's Community Center. We have some resources available if you're interested." Marcus accepted the soup, but kept his distance emotionally. "Heard it all before," he said, his voice rough from cold and disuse. "Waiting lists longer than my arm, and requirements I can't meet without an address I don't have." I understood his skepticism completely. "You're right," I said. "The system isn't perfect, and sometimes it feels like it's designed to keep people out rather than help them in. But there are good people working within that system, trying to make a difference." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes while he drank the soup. Finally, he looked at me with curiosity rather than suspicion. "You talk like someone who knows," he said. "I do know," I replied. 2 years ago, my son and I spent the coldest night of the winter right here in this doorway. We almost didn't make it." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, the walls of mistrust beginning to crack. "What happened? How'd you get out?" I told him about that night, about the desperation and the prayer and the presence that had saved us. I didn't mention the supernatural aspects of our rescue, because I had learned that people needed to be ready to hear that part of the story. Instead, I focused on the human elements, the community center that had taken us in, the transitional housing program that had given us time to rebuild, the job training that had led to meaningful work. "The most important thing," I said, "was learning to accept help. For months, I was so proud and so scared that I wouldn't let anyone get close enough to actually assist us. I thought accepting charity meant admitting defeat, but I learned that accepting help means admitting we're human." Marcus finished the soup and handed back the thermos. "How's your boy now?" I smiled, thinking of Tommy at 9 years old, thriving in school and full of dreams about becoming a teacher someday. "He's amazing, resilient in ways that still surprise me. And he remembers that night differently than I do. He talks about the man who helped us like he was an angel or something." "Maybe he was," Marcus said quietly. "I've been on the streets long enough to know that sometimes help comes from strange places." By the end of our conversation, Marcus had agreed to come with me to the community center the next day, not because he fully trusted the system, but because he trusted my story. It was a start, and I had learned that starts were sacred things that shouldn't be rushed or forced. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since that frozen December night. Tommy and I had moved out of transitional housing into a small 2-bedroom apartment that we could afford on my salary. It wasn't luxurious, but it was ours, filled with furniture we had chosen, and walls covered with Tommy's artwork and photos of friends we had made. My work at the community center had evolved beyond case management into program development. I had helped design new protocols for serving families with children, drawing on our experience to identify gaps in services and create more compassionate approaches to intake and assessment. The job gave me purpose beyond mere survival, connecting our ordeal to something larger and more meaningful. Tommy had adapted remarkably well to stability, though he still kept snacks hidden in his room and sometimes woke up in the middle of the night to check that I was still there. His teacher said he showed unusual empathy for classmates who were struggling, often sharing his lunch with children who seemed hungry or inviting quiet kids to join his games at recess. The wooden cross still sat on my nightstand, now accompanied by a small photo of Tommy and me taken at his school's spring concert. In the picture, we're both smiling genuine smiles, the kind that reach all the way to your eyes. Looking at it, reminded me how far we had traveled from that frozen doorway. Not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Church had become a regular part of our routine, not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude and a desire to be part of a community that values service to others. Tommy sang in the children's choir, his clear voice joining with others to create something beautiful and harmonious. I volunteered with the food pantry and helped coordinate the annual winter outreach program, making sure that no one would spend Christmas on the streets if we could prevent it. But it was the quiet moments that held the most meaning. Bedtime conversations with Tommy about his dreams for the future, morning coffee while watching the sunrise through our kitchen window, and the simple peace of knowing that we belonged somewhere, that we were safe and valued and loved. One evening, as I was tucking Tommy into bed, he asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. "Mommy, do you think we'll ever see that man again? The one who helped us?" I thought about it for a moment, considering not just the literal question, but the deeper spiritual truth it represented. "I think," I said finally, "that if we keep our eyes open, we see him all the time, in every person who offers help without expecting anything back, in every moment of kindness that comes just when we need it most, in every reminder that we're not alone in this world." Tommy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "Like when Mrs. Rodriguez gave me extra crackers when I was still scared about not having enough food." "Exactly like that," I said, kissing his forehead. "And like when you shared your lunch with Kevin when he forgot his money. You were being Jesus for him." The concept seemed to delight him, and he fell asleep with a smile on his face, secure in the knowledge that he was both protected and called to protect others. Later that night, I stood at our living room window looking out at the city lights, thinking about all the people who were spending that night without shelter, without safety, without hope. I said a prayer for them, asking that they would find the help they needed and the strength to accept it when it came. And I said a prayer of thanksgiving for the mysterious intervention that had saved us, for the community that had welcomed us, and for the opportunity to transform our experience of receiving grace into the practice of extending it to others. The wooden cross caught the light from the street lamp outside, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I felt that same presence that had found us in our darkest hour, warm, loving, and eternally faithful. Whether it was memory or reality, it filled me with the same peace I had felt that night. The assurance that love was real and active in the world, always seeking opportunities to break through despair with hope. Our story had come full circle, from receiving mercy to extending it, from being lost to helping others find their way home. And I knew that this was just the beginning, that there were more people to help, more miracles to witness, and more opportunities to be part of the love that saved us and continues to save us every day. Tommy and I had learned that grace wasn't a one-time intervention, but a daily gift, offered fresh each morning with the sunrise. We had been found by love in our deepest need, and now we spent our days looking for chances to be love for others in theirs. The wooden cross would remain on my nightstand, a reminder that we were never truly alone, that help was always available, and that sometimes the greatest miracles were the ones that turned survivors into healers, transforming our wounds into sources of wisdom and our rescue into reasons to rescue others. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.